He changed after we slept together, and that's when I knew I had to end it. I met Ethan on a Tuesday evening in late spring, one of those nights when the city feels like it's holding its breath between seasons. The air was still warm from the afternoon sun, but there was a softness to it, a promise of quiet. I was 29, single, and in that strange space between independence and longing. I wasn't desperate for love, not anymore, but I was ready for something real, something steady, something honest. We matched on a dating app I had promised myself I'd deleted. His profile was simple, a few pictures, a short bio, and a line that made me stop scrolling. It said, "Looking for calm in the noise." It felt like a line written for me. I had spent years chasing men who mistook chaos for passion, and here was someone who seemed to want peace. Our first conversation was easy. He wasn't trying too hard to be funny, or clever, or mysterious. He asked real questions, about my work, my travels, the kind of books I liked. We talked for hours that night, the kind of long, unguarded conversation that feels rare these days. When we finally met for coffee, it felt natural, like a continuation of something that had already begun. He smiled in that disarming way some men do, the kind that makes you feel like you're being seen, rather than watched. He had this calm confidence about him, not arrogant, not performative, just steady. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his voice was low and deliberate, like every word had been thought through before it left his mouth. After that first date, I remember walking home through the quiet streets, smiling to myself. There was nothing particularly grand about the evening, no fireworks, no movie scene moments, but there was something rare about how safe it felt. I didn't feel like I had to impress him. I didn't feel small. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm that felt like a relief after years of mismatched expectations. He'd text me good morning, call me in the evenings, plan small but thoughtful dates, walks by the river, cooking dinner together, lazy Sundays where we'd just talk about everything and nothing. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that felt like it could become love if given time. He told me about his work in marketing, how he'd always wanted to start his own firm one day. He told me about his parents' divorce when he was a teenager, how it made him cautious about relationships. "I just don't like playing games," he said once. "If I care about someone, I want them to know it." At the time, that sounded perfect. I didn't realize that people who tell you they hate games often have their own kind, quieter, subtler, harder to spot. He was attentive, funny in a dry way that made me laugh unexpectedly. He remembered small details, like how I took my coffee, or how I got anxious during thunderstorms. He made me playlists filled with old songs I'd mentioned liking once. I told my best friend about him, and she smiled in that skeptical way friends do when they've seen you fall too fast before. "Just take your time," she said. "People are always on their best behavior in the beginning." She was right, of course. But back then, I wanted to believe that maybe this time, things could be different. Ethan had a habit of making the ordinary feel special. One night, he showed up at my apartment with takeout and a small bouquet of wildflowers. "They reminded me of you," he said simply. He never said things like that dramatically. It was always soft, matter of fact, and that made it feel more real. We'd sit on my couch, talking until midnight, about everything from childhood memories to the kind of lives we hoped to build someday. He'd listen with that same stillness that first drew me in, and I'd find myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. And yet, even in those early days, there were moments, small ones, that didn't quite fit. Little flashes of something sharper beneath the calm. Once, when I mentioned an old friend from college, he asked, too casually, "Is he still around?" Another time, he teased me about how organized my apartment was, saying, "You probably color-code your emotions, too." It was said with a laugh, but something in his tone made me pause. Still, I brushed it off. Everyone has edges, I told myself. Everyone has bad days, and besides, he always made up for it. A kind word here, a tender gesture there. That's how charm works. It gives you just enough warmth to make you forget the chill. After a month, I started to feel something deeper pulling me toward him. Not just attraction, but trust. He had become part of my daily life, a name that showed up in my mornings and lingered in my nights. He'd ask me to send pictures of my lunch just because he said it made him feel close to me. I thought it was cute. Maybe it was at first. We were both adults, and we both knew where things were heading. I wasn't naive about intimacy. I knew what it meant, what it could change. But I also believed that with the right person, it didn't have to change anything at all. It could just be an extension of closeness. So one evening, when he came over after dinner and we ended up staying up late talking and laughing, it felt right. Not rushed, not pressured, just two people falling into something that had been quietly building between them. When we kissed, it wasn't dramatic or urgent. It was slow, natural, like a conversation we'd both been waiting to have. He stayed the night. I remember lying beside him afterward, the city light slipping through the blinds, painting the walls in soft lines of gold. He held my hand, tracing small circles with his thumb. Everything felt calm, easy, safe. But the next morning, something was different. It wasn't a big thing at first. Not a fight, not even a word. Just a shift. His energy changed, subtly but unmistakably. The quiet between us wasn't comfortable anymore. It was heavy, like air before a storm. He didn't kiss me good morning. He didn't smile the same way. He looked at me like someone who'd crossed a finish line he'd been sprinting toward. And now that he'd arrived, he wasn't sure what to do next. I made coffee, tried to act normal, filled the silence with small talk. He answered, but it felt like he was elsewhere. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. He looked around my apartment, my small, carefully kept space, and said, "You really like being in control, don't you? With your little apartment and your organized life?" He smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was smug. I laughed it off, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," he said, already walking toward the door. "It's just, you seem like the type who always needs to have things perfect." That was the first crack in the glass. After he left, I sat there for a long time, my coffee growing cold. I told myself not to overthink it, but deep down, something uneasy had settled in me. I didn't know it yet, but that morning was the start of the unraveling, the moment the performance ended and the truth began to show. Because sometimes, love stories don't fall apart with screaming or betrayal. Sometimes they fall apart in silence, in the space between who someone pretended to be and who they really are. And that silence was about to get louder. The day after Ethan left my apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant. I caught myself glancing at my phone, waiting for a message that didn't come. Normally, he'd send something sweet in the mornings. "Good coffee today?" Or "Thinking of you?" But that day, nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars outside. I told myself not to spiral. People get busy. Maybe he had an early meeting. Maybe his phone died. There were 100 reasonable explanations, but reason doesn't stop your gut from knowing the truth before your mind catches up. By noon, I broke and sent the first text. "Hey, hope your morning's going okay." It took 3 hours for him to respond. "Yeah, just been catching up on work. Talk later, talk later. Not can't wait to see you or miss you already." Just a detached acknowledgement, like I was a coworker checking in about a project. I tried to ignore the sting. That evening he called. His tone was calm, casual, too casual. He talked about his day like nothing had changed. But there was a coldness there, like someone had turned down the emotional thermostat without warning. When I brought up how quiet he'd been, he deflected. "I didn't realize you were keeping score," he said with a chuckle that wasn't funny. That was new. The version of Ethan I knew, or thought I knew, never spoke to me like that. Still, I tried to keep the peace. "I'm not keeping score," I said softly. "I just noticed the shift, that's all." He exhaled like I was being dramatic. "Ava, I like you." "You know that." "I just have a lot going on right now." Don't overthink it. That phrase, "don't overthink it," has ended more relationships than dishonesty ever did. It's the quiet knife people use when they want to make you doubt your own intuition. But I swallowed it. I told myself he was tired. Everyone has off days. The next time we saw each other, a few days later, it felt like meeting a stranger who happened to have the same face as someone I cared about. He still said the right words. He complimented my hair, told me I looked beautiful, but there was no warmth behind it. It felt like he was reciting a script he'd grown bored of. We ordered takeout and watched a movie, the kind of easy night that used to feel comfortable. But halfway through, I noticed he wasn't really there. His body was next to me, but his attention wasn't. He was scrolling through his phone, barely reacting when I laughed or tried to talk. At one point, I reached over and took his hand. Something simple, something natural. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold it either. His fingers just rested there, limp, like obligation. That was when it really sank in. Something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back. I didn't sleep that night. When he left in the morning, I sat by the window long after the door closed, trying to piece together what had changed. The night we'd shared should have deepened our connection, not hollowed it out. But it was as if in his mind intimacy had been a goal, and once he reached it, the game ended. Over the next few weeks, his effort dwindled. No more thoughtful dates, no more playlists. He still came over, but it wasn't the same. He expected me to plan everything, to host, to make things easy. And when I didn't, when I asked him to meet me halfway, he'd make little jokes that stung. "You like things your way, huh?" He'd say, smirking. "You probably schedule your emotions too." Sometimes I laughed it off because confronting it felt exhausting. Other times I'd go quiet, and he'd tilt his head with that infuriating look, half amused, half superior, as if he'd caught me failing some unspoken test. I started noticing how he used charm like armor. When I pushed for clarity, he'd turn soft again, say something sweet, kiss my forehead, and I'd let my guard down. But as soon as I relaxed, the coldness would return. That's the thing about emotional manipulation. It doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like confusion. One evening, I decided to bring it up. "Ethan," I said gently, "did something change between us? After that night?" He looked at me for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he smiled, that practiced dismissive smile, and said, "You're reading into things again." "I'm not," I said quietly. "I just want to understand what's going on." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Ava, not everything has to be analyzed. You're making this heavier than it is. He said it so calmly, so confidently, that for a second I wondered if he was right. Maybe I was overanalyzing. Maybe I was expecting too much. But the hollow ache in my chest told me otherwise. That night, after he left, I sat in bed and wrote in my journal. Something I hadn't done in months. I wrote down everything. His tone, his words, the way he looked at me like I'd become a task instead of a person. I wrote about how intimacy, instead of bringing us closer, had made him retreat. And then I wrote a single sentence that scared me. I think he was performing the whole time. Once I saw those words on paper, I couldn't unsee the pattern. The grand gestures in the beginning, the way he mirrored my energy, the perfectly timed compliments. It wasn't connection, it was strategy. He wasn't building something with me. He was winning something from me. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in small, painful waves, in every delayed reply, every half-hearted kiss, every conversation where I could feel him somewhere else. He began talking to me differently. Not directly cruel, but condescending in ways that left invisible bruises. "You're so independent," he'd say with that smirk. "It must be hard for you to let anyone in." It sounded like a compliment, but it wasn't. It was a reminder that he saw my strength as something to break down. He'd make comments about my work. "You really think people read those long articles you write? Or about my friends? They seem a little intense, don't they? Always subtle, always under the guise of humor." I started questioning myself without realizing it. That's how people like him work. Not by shattering you, but by eroding you slowly, until you're unsure of your own edges. My best friend Lily noticed before I did. One night, we went out for dinner, and after a few glasses of wine, she said, "You don't sound like yourself anymore." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You sound smaller," she said softly. "Like you're trying to convince yourself that something good is still happening when it's not." I tried to laugh it off, but her words hit something inside me. I'd been shrinking without realizing it. My voice, my opinions, my joy, all quieter now. I was accommodating someone who no longer cared to meet me halfway. The next time Ethan came over, I watched him more closely. The way he sat, slouched, scrolling through his phone. The way he asked questions without listening to the answers. The way he seemed bored with the very thing he once said he wanted. When he left that night, I didn't walk him to the door. I just said, "Good night," and watched him from the window as he walked down the street. He didn't look back. Something in me broke quietly then. Not from heartbreak, but from clarity. Because sometimes the saddest part of losing someone isn't the loss itself. It's realizing they were never really there to begin with, and I was starting to understand that the man I'd fallen for wasn't real. He was an image, one carefully built to win affection, not to give it. That night, for the first time since we'd met, I didn't check my phone before bed. I didn't wait for a text that would never come. I just lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing, and tried to remember what it felt like to be at peace. It had only been 6 weeks since I'd met Ethan, but already, I felt years older, and deep down, I knew this story wasn't leading toward love. It was leading toward an ending. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. The unraveling didn't happen in a dramatic explosion. There was no fight, no confrontation that left the air cracked with anger. It was quieter than that, slow, deliberate, the way a candle burns down without anyone noticing until the flame flickers and dies. The more I watched Ethan, the more I realized that the version of him I had fallen for existed only in glimpses, brief moments designed to keep me hopeful. He was like a mirror that only reflected what I wanted to see. And every time I tried to look past the surface, he tilted it away. Weeks passed, and the gap between us widened. We still saw each other, but the connection felt performative. I'd catch him looking at his phone when I spoke, his eyes glazed over, his mind clearly elsewhere. When I'd pause mid-sentence, he wouldn't even notice. The man who once memorized my favorite coffee order now couldn't remember which street I lived on without checking his GPS. One night, we went out to dinner, the first time he'd suggested a date in almost a month. For a moment, I thought maybe this was his way of trying again. I even wore the dress he once said made me look like sunlight. But halfway through dinner, as I was telling a story about my childhood, he interrupted to say, "You always talk like you're in a documentary." I blinked. "What does that mean?" He smirked, sipping his drink. "Just that you always sound so polished, like you've rehearsed everything." I laughed, though it came out hollow. "Maybe I just like to think before I speak." He leaned back, eyes sharp. "Or maybe you just don't like being real." The words hit harder than I expected. He said it casually, almost teasingly, but there was poison in it, the kind that doesn't sting right away, only sinks deeper with time. The rest of dinner was a blur. I don't remember the food, or the walk home, or the way the city lights flickered through the car window. I only remember the sound of his voice, replaying in my mind like static. When he dropped me off that night, he kissed me quickly, more out of habit than affection, and said, "You're overthinking again. Don't ruin a good thing." That was the moment I realized. It wasn't a good thing. It was just a convenient one. After that night, something inside me began to shift. I stopped trying so hard to make him comfortable. I stopped cushioning my words, stopped pretending that his distance didn't hurt. And that's when his true nature surfaced completely. When people like Ethan sense they're losing control, they don't apologize. They manipulate. He started using guilt as a weapon. If I didn't respond to his texts right away, he'd say things like, "You're acting distant lately," even though he'd been cold for weeks. If I tried to talk about my feelings, he'd sigh and say, "Why does everything have to be a deep conversation with you?" Once, when I told him that I felt unappreciated, he looked at me and said, "You should really work on your self-esteem. You always need reassurance." It wasn't just what he said, it was how calmly he said it, how confident he was that I'd question myself instead of him. And for a while, I did. I replayed every conversation in my head, wondering if I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too much. Until one afternoon, I came across a message he'd accidentally left open on his laptop. It wasn't from another woman, nothing dramatic like that. It was a chat with a friend. "She's great, man, just a little intense. I think she caught feelings faster than I did." Then another line, one that twisted my stomach into knots. "It's fine, though. I got what I wanted." I sat there staring at the words, my heartbeat so loud it drowned out everything else. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just closed the laptop and sat in silence, the kind of silence that feels deafening. It wasn't about what he'd wanted. It was about what it revealed, that every gesture, every word, every moment that felt genuine had been calculated. He hadn't fallen for me. He'd been performing affection until he no longer needed to. That night, he texted me like nothing had happened. "You free tomorrow?" I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Sure. Come by at 6. When he arrived, I was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes from clarity. He walked in, kissed my cheek, and dropped his jacket on the chair like he owned the place. I watched him move around my apartment, so familiar, yet so foreign now. We talked for a few minutes. Small talk, the kind that feels like pretending. Then I said quietly, "I saw the message." He froze. "What message?" "The one you sent your friend." "About me." His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed unreadable. "You went through my laptop?" I almost laughed. "That's your takeaway?" He shrugged, playing it cool. "Look, Ava, you're taking things out of context. It was just locker room talk. You know how guys are." "No," I said evenly. "I actually don't." He sighed, sitting down on the couch. "I didn't mean it like that. I don't know. I panicked. Things were moving fast." "Things weren't moving fast," I said. "They were moving honestly, until they weren't." He rubbed his face, frustrated. "You're making this way bigger than it is. We had fun, didn't we? Why ruin it by overanalyzing?" And there it was again. That word. Overanalyzing. His favorite shield. His way of making me feel like reason was irrational. I stood up, my hands shaking. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Ethan? You think connection is something you win. I think it's something you earn. You never wanted to know me. You just wanted to conquer me." For a moment, he looked at me, really looked at me, as if realizing for the first time that he couldn't control how this would end. Then his expression shifted into something I'll never forget. Amusement. "You're being dramatic," he said, standing. "But if this is how you want to end it, fine." He walked to the door, grabbed his jacket, and turned back. "You'll miss me, though. You always do." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The sound of the door closing behind him said everything. That night, I deleted his number. I didn't block him, not out of hope, but out of indifference. I didn't want to erase him. I wanted to remember what it looked like when someone showed you their true face. In the weeks that followed, I went through all the stages of grief: denial, anger, sadness, clarity. But what surprised me most was the relief. I thought I'd feel heartbroken, but instead I felt lighter, like I'd been holding my breath for months and finally exhaled. I started noticing small things again. The way sunlight hit my kitchen counter in the morning, the smell of coffee, the quiet peace of being alone. My friends said I seemed different. "You look softer," Lily told me one afternoon. "Like you came back to yourself." Maybe I had. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with closure. It comes with acceptance, with realizing that some people aren't meant to stay, only to teach you something. Ethan taught me that words mean nothing without consistency, that attraction without respect is just control in disguise. And most of all, he taught me that the real red flags aren't always loud. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they smile, sometimes they look like the exact thing you thought you wanted. The morning after Ethan walked out of my apartment for the last time, I didn't feel the ache I thought I would. No crying into the pillow, no staring at my phone waiting for his name to appear on the screen. There was only stillness, quiet, weightless stillness. It was as if his absence had uncluttered the air. For days, I moved through my routines in silence, half expecting the hollowness to come crashing down later. But it didn't. What replaced it wasn't sadness. It was awareness. Awareness of how much space I had given him, how many of my days had revolved around waiting for his calls, his texts, his approval. When that waiting ended, I realized how much of myself I'd left on hold. The first thing I did was reclaim my apartment. His jacket was still hanging over the chair by the door. His toothbrush sat on the bathroom counter. I gathered everything that was his, the hoodie he'd accidentally left, the cheap cologne he thought I liked, the book he never finished reading, and placed it all in a box. I didn't throw it out right away. It sat by the door for 3 days like a final test. Every time I passed by, I looked at it and asked myself, do you miss him? Or do you just miss the version of yourself who believed he was good for you? By the third day, I knew the answer. I carried the box to the nearest donation center and handed it over. The man behind the counter smiled and asked if I wanted a receipt. No, I said, I'm finally done keeping records. That evening, I came home to an apartment that felt new again. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was soft, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. I made myself dinner, played some music, danced barefoot in my kitchen. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't performing for anyone. I was just living, but healing isn't linear. Some nights, the memories still came creeping back. The sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand, the way he used to say my name. I'd lie awake replaying moments that didn't even belong to me anymore. There's a cruel kind of nostalgia that comes after a relationship ends, not for the person, but for the illusion. I missed who I thought he was. The man who asked about my dreams, who remembered my favorite songs, who made me believe we were building something real. I had to keep reminding myself that the version I missed never existed. He was a story he told me, and I had mistaken it for truth. Weeks passed. The ache faded. The clarity stayed. One afternoon, I went to the same cafe where Ethan and I had our first date. I hadn't planned it. I was just walking by, and something in me wanted to sit where it all began. The same table by the window was empty. I ordered a coffee and opened my notebook, the one I used to write in when I needed to make sense of things. For a long time, I just stared at the blank page. Then I wrote, "You can't lose what was never yours, but you can reclaim what you gave away." The words came easily after that. Paragraphs poured out of me, everything I'd wanted to say but never did. About how I'd mistaken effort for empathy, attention for care, desire for love. About how easy it is to confuse someone's intensity for depth, when all it really is control wrapped in charm. By the time I looked up, the cafe was nearly empty, the light outside turning golden. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief, just calm understanding. That night, I dreamt of him for the first time since he left. But it wasn't one of those dreams that pull you back into longing. In the dream, we were sitting across from each other at that same cafe. He was talking, but his voice was muffled, distant like it was underwater. I just watched him, realizing I didn't feel anything anymore. Not love, not hate, not even curiosity. I woke up smiling. That was the first morning I knew, truly knew, I was free. A few days later, I saw him again, by accident. I was walking downtown with Lily when I heard someone call my name. I turned, and there he was. He looked almost exactly the same, but smaller somehow. Not physically, just smaller in presence. Like the illusion that once made him magnetic had faded. "Ava," he said, smiling that same practiced smile. "It's been a while." "It has," I replied calmly. "How have you been?" "Good," I said simply. "Really good." He nodded, studying me for a moment. "You look different." "I feel different," I said. There was a pause. He glanced at Lily, then back at me. "You still writing?" "Always." He smiled faintly, but his eyes told me everything. He wanted to know if I missed him. He wanted to see if the performance still worked. But it didn't. Not anymore. After a few awkward small talk exchanges, he said, "We should catch up sometime." I shook my head, still smiling. There's nothing to catch up on. For a moment, his mask slipped, just a flicker of frustration before he regained control. "Right," he said. "Take care, Ava. You too." And that was it. No dramatic goodbye, no closure speech, no regret. Just two people standing in the middle of a busy street, one free, one still pretending. As I walked away, Lily looked at me and said, "You handled that like a saint." I laughed. "No," I said. "I just stopped mistaking silence for peace." That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights blur into the dark. For the first time, the reflection staring back at me didn't look tired or broken. It looked whole. It took me months to get here, to realize that endings don't always need explosions. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most powerful. The ones where you simply walk away, choose yourself, and never look back. There's strength in leaving, but even more in not needing to be understood when you do. By the time I closed my eyes that night, I wasn't thinking about Ethan anymore. I was thinking about the woman I had become. The one who learned that love isn't about being chosen. It's about choosing yourself when someone else won't, and I finally did. There's a strange kind of silence that follows the end of a relationship. Not the silence of loneliness, but of recalibration. When everything you built around someone collapses, You're left with a wide, empty space that used to be filled by noise, by texts, by expectation. And in that silence, you finally hear the sound of yourself again. That's where I found myself in the months after Ethan. Not broken, not bitter, just still. Like the ocean after a storm, steadying itself before it learns how to move again. I started spending my weekends alone, not out of isolation but by choice. I'd take long walks without headphones, let the city's hum fill the gaps where he used to be. I began noticing things again. The smell of bakeries in the morning, the laughter spilling out of open cafes, the way strangers smiled at each other without wanting anything in return. It's funny how much of the world you stop seeing when your eyes are fixed on one person. The more distance I put between myself and that relationship, the clearer everything became. Ethan hadn't changed after we slept together. He had revealed himself. The shift wasn't sudden. It was just the first time I saw what was always there. That realization came slowly, in moments of reflection. Like when I remembered how he used to correct me mid-sentence, or how he'd roll his eyes when I spoke passionately about something I loved. I used to think those were small things, harmless quirks. But now I understood that they weren't small at all. They were signs, warnings, the kind that whisper before they scream, and I ignored them, not because I was foolish, but because I wanted to believe in him more than I believed in myself. That's the part no one tells you about manipulation. It doesn't start with control. It starts with attention. It starts with someone making you feel like you've finally been seen after years of invisibility. And when you start to depend on that light, they learn exactly how to dim it. It took me time to unlearn the need for that validation. To realize that love that feels like performance is not love, it's theater. It's someone handing you a script where your only line is yes. I remember the exact day I felt truly free. It wasn't a grand moment. I was sitting on my balcony with a cup of coffee, sunlight on my skin, and I realized I hadn't thought about him in weeks. I hadn't compared new people to him, hadn't wondered what he was doing, hadn't felt the urge to check his social media. He was just gone, not in the way that leaves a hole, but in the way a storm passes, leaving behind clearer skies. That's when I understood something simple yet profound. Peace isn't found when someone else chooses you. It's found when you stop needing to be chosen. After Ethan, I started writing again. Not about him, not directly, but about the patterns we fall into when we mistake attention for affection. I wrote essays about emotional boundaries, about the way love can feel like addiction when it's unhealthy, about the difference between wanting someone and respecting them. My words reached people I'd never met, women who wrote back saying, I thought I was the only one. And that's when I realized I hadn't just healed. I had transformed the pain into purpose. It's easy to demonize someone like Ethan, to label him the villain of my story. But over time, I stopped doing that. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved freedom. Anger ties you to the past just as tightly as love does. Letting go isn't about excusing what happened, it's about refusing to carry it forward. One night, months later, I got a message from an unknown number. Hey, hope you're doing okay. I've been thinking about you. It was him. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart surprisingly calm. The old me would have overanalyzed the message, tried to read between the lines. But now I didn't need to. There were no hidden meanings. It was just a man reaching out from a place he no longer belonged. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Sometimes closure is silence," and that was enough. As time passed, I began dating again, slowly, cautiously, but with more clarity than before. I didn't look for perfection. I looked for presence, for consistency, for kindness that didn't need to announce itself. I learned to listen not to what people say when they want you, but to how they act once they have you. Because that's the real test. Not how someone treats you when they're chasing your love, but how they treat you when they already have it. Now, when I talk to women who are where I once was, standing at the edge of confusion, sensing that something is wrong but afraid to name it, I tell them this: pay attention to the shift. The way their tone changes, the way curiosity fades into criticism, the way affection turns into entitlement. That's not love evolving, that's illusion dissolving. And when that happens, don't beg for clarity. Walk away. Because anyone who makes you feel smaller after intimacy never wanted to love you. They wanted to own the idea of you. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that love isn't measured by how deeply someone desires you, but by how gently they handle you once they have the chance. Real love doesn't conquer. It respects. It nurtures. It doesn't need to win. It just wants to stay. A year later, I went back to that same cafe one last time. I ordered the same coffee I always did, sat by the same window, and pulled out my old notebook. I flipped through the pages, the heartbreak, the healing, the lessons, and realized how far I'd come. There was a time I thought losing him had broken me. Now I understood it had rebuilt me. I smiled to myself, took a sip of coffee, and wrote one final line. He changed after we slept together. But that's when I finally started changing too. Then I closed the notebook, paid for my coffee, and walked out into the sunlight, no longer defined by the story that once hurt me, but by the woman who survived it.